For those of you who are a part of my class, aren't a part of my class, I'm Dr. Jason Rich. I'm associated with the Nunn School here at Georgia Tech. Anytime we have such a distinguished individual like Robert Bell in to talk, they always make sure that they bring in someone more distinguished than me to introduce him. So we have Alistair Young, who is a full professor in the Nunn School, and he's going to do the proper introduction for somebody as distinguished as Robert Bell. So.
Thank you, Jason. It's actually not true at all. I mean, Jason's being very gracious in letting us canalize his class. As Jason said, I'm Alistair Young. I'm a professor in the Nunn School. I also co-direct the Center for European and Transatlantic Studies, and I'm acting co-director for the Center for International Strategy, Technology, and Policy, which are co-sponsoring this event. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce Robert Bell, who has a long career, including supporting the Senate Committees on Foreign Relations and Armed Services, serving on the National Security Council, and working for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. From 2010 to 2017, he was the senior representative of the Secretary of Defense in Europe and the defense advisor to the US ambassador to NATO. He is now a professor of the practice in the Nunn School, and so I'm honored to be able to call him my colleague. Well,
thank you, Alistair. And which button advances my slides? Yeah, so that one doesn't work. And that one doesn't work. That one works.
Which one we're doing? I know it's doing.
Okay, we're in business. So I'm delighted, I mean not quite sincerely, to be with a group of aspiring degree-holding students. I'm an aspiring to a degree-holding student myself in my third year now towards my PhD at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. I have finished my comprehensive exam, so I just have to write the dissertation now. I don't have to sit in any more classrooms. So, but I do feel your pain. We're talking about the INF Treaty today. I know most people here are in an Introduction to IR class, and there's some augmentation in the audience beyond that class. But at the heart of international relations throughout history, you've had treaties. I mean, you go back to the Peloponnesian Wars, go back to the founding of this country. Treaties are a key element of international relations and diplomacy. So what we're talking about today is what happens after a treaty. What is life like in Europe? European security after INF. And to do that, I want to really address 4 questions. When I was a cadet at the Air Force Academy, they said never more than 3 questions to be addressed. But I'm going to push the limits here because I know this is Georgia Tech students. We'll go to 4, okay? Actually, the limitation was more, we weren't sure we could balance more than 3 ideas in our mind at one time. It wasn't a reflection of what they thought the audience could take on board. But if you look on the right, except for anyone who was just in Professor Markley's class, do you know where that picture was taken of those 2 missiles and what the 2 missiles are? That's in the Air and Space Museum on the Mall in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. On the left, you have a Soviet, what's left of a Soviet SS-20 nuclear intermediate range missile, and on the right, a United States Pershing II nuclear missile. It's kind of scary when issues that you personally worked on as an adult are featured in a museum. You know, it's like, what's your shelf life? But they're there. So let's just remind you what the INF Treaty was and what it accomplished and why was it lost, and then turn really to the core of this, which is, given that this key building block of international relations, indeed international security, given that it's been lost, what's going to happen now? Nope. So, yeah. So the year is 1979. I don't think anyone in this audience was alive in 1979, except maybe for me. Now Steve is here. Okay. I was working as the staff director of the military committee of NATO's legislative branch, the Parliamentary Assembly in Brussels, when we became, the sort of the foreign policy practitioners that were involved in NATO became increasingly focused on that missile that's above 1979. That's the Soviet SS-20. And the Soviets began deploying very large numbers of nuclear missiles in the western parts of the Soviet Union aimed at key targets in NATO. And as that little scoreboard said, in 1979, Soviets had gotten 826 short and intermediate range deployed, not all SS-20s, but SS-20s were the main threat. And the United States had none. So that's sort of a disadvantageous starting point for a negotiation in terms of bargaining leverage. The Europeans became extremely concerned about what these missiles meant in terms of their security. The initial reaction in Washington, Jimmy Carter, by the way, was president from Georgia. The initial word from Washington was, don't worry, we got this. Got your back, guys. We've got ICBMs, got B-52 bombers, we've got submarines. You know, we got a gazillion nukes. Don't worry about those SS-20s. We got you covered. We can deter that with the systems we have. And it was the Europeans. We think of the Europeans as being, you know, from Venus, not Mars, but it was the Europeans that said, oof, not sure about that. We're anxious that if there's a crisis with the Soviet Union and you don't have any skin in the game over here on the soil of Western Europe, you may take a walk. We need physical evidence of reassurance. We need to see, not boots on the ground, because we had about 300,000 troops in Europe, but we need to see nukes on the ground. So NATO began a great debate. What to do? And there was a very strong camp that said, we've got to deploy new systems to counter the Soviet systems so Europe will be assured and deterrence will be maintained. But this was not a popular proposal. The protest in 1979 and then later as these systems began to be deployed were phenomenal. Actually, sort of the greatest in history. Larger protest crowds than anything you've ever seen for climate change or a Trump visit or anything else that gets people in the street. Anti-globalism, G7 meetings. 300,000 people in the streets of Amsterdam. That's just one example. I was working in Brussels. I saw this every day. The parliamentarian that I was working for, the chairman of the Defense Committee of NATO's Parliamentary Assembly, was 100% opposed to deploying these new systems. So a compromise had to be reached. And as often is the case in international relations, which you're studying, you take something from column A and something from column B and put it together and hope it sticks. So NATO decided something that they called the double track. Track 1, deploy 108 Pershing missiles and 464 cruise missiles, spread them out in 5 countries so nobody carries the weight. Then we have a deterrence in being against these Soviet systems. But since that's not sustainable politically, given the huge rebellion against this among our population and within many parliaments, there's got to be an arms control track. You have to negotiate this while you're deploying so you can try to negotiate the systems away before they're deployed. Then we won't have to worry about the systems. And anyway, Jimmy Carter's president of the United States, so what could go wrong? Right? What could go wrong? Oops. Events intervened. Carter lost. Reagan won. Much like Donald Trump. Reagan's campaign position was that Carter's treaties were the worst ever negotiated by America. that we had gone socialist, that we could only negotiate with the Soviets from a position of strength, peace through strength. None of this namby-pamby arms control stuff. Let's spend 8 years building up our strategic forces and our conventional forces, get rid of all these old treaties like ABM and the SALT agreements that Nixon and Ford and Carter came up with. We're going to be tough. New day, new dawning in America, right? That's the position that Ronald Reagan took into the White House. So it wasn't a big surprise then, after Reagan came in, that his first thought was to say, well, screw this, and we'll just deploy the systems but not have arms control. Fortunately, at least back then, there were still senior national security advisors that would speak truth to power, and they said, Mr. President, sorry, that's not going to work. We will lose the NATO alliance if we try that. You'll have countries splintering and leaving the alliance. So then among Reagan's advisors, there was a debate, okay, if we had to propose something, what can we propose? This, something that does the least harm to what we really want to do. And they came up with this idea of a zero option. We'll propose that they get rid of all their 826 systems, and although we have none, we won't deploy ours if they get rid of their 826. 826 to zero. How many of you would take that deal? So this provoked a huge crisis. Within NATO, a whole bunch of allies said, wait a minute, you can't be serious. This is not a serious negotiating position. It must be a contemptuous insult or something. Among the president's own negotiators, his lead negotiator, Ambassador Paul Nitze, was really a great American. He was so dismayed by what he was told to try to negotiate that he went on his own, walked in the woods. There was later a Broadway play, which is fantastic about this, with his Soviet counterpart. And they came in on their own authority with an agreement that set ceilings and let each side, have a certain number of these systems. That agreement was repudiated then, back in the White House, by Reagan. But by the way, in the same way that Donald Trump just repudiated the ADREF agreement that his lead negotiator in Afghanistan had signed with the Taliban. So these things happen. It's not unique to Trump. Negotiators try to get an agreement, they bring it back to Washington, and then someone has a better idea. So the Soviets walked out. They said, screw this. This doesn't make any sense. And they were out of the negotiations for 2 years, empty chair in Geneva. Then Gorbachev came in. Gorbachev, of course, tried to save the Soviet Union. Perestroika and glasnost, engage the West, bring in some free market economy, reduce the cost of defense through arms control, and slowly, including an extraordinary conference that Gorbachev had with Reagan in Iceland in a haunted house, the Hofte House Hotel in Reykjavik, where Reagan actually proposed that both sides completely eliminate their nuclear weapons in return for both sides deploying Star Wars. That actually happened in 1986. Fortunately, I guess, Gorbachev said, well, I may be crazy, but I'm not that crazy. So in time, you got this INF agreement with Gorbachev and his foreign policy minister, Shevardnadze, that was the zero option. So even though it started out like, you got to be kidding me, that's the deal we got. The treaty that was negotiated was overwhelmingly on U.S. terms. No systems would be permitted anywhere in the world, not just in Europe, but of a certain range, including ones that didn't even have nuclear warheads, just conventional warheads, because they weren't sure you could tell the difference. And there could be cheating if you allowed conventional warheads. And the Soviet insistence that our allies' missiles, nuclear missiles, like the French and the British, we said, no. And the Soviets said, okay. So we got this treaty on our terms, basically, against all odds. And it's generally viewed as one of the most successful arms control treaties ever, and it lasted 30 years. Certainly Ronald Reagan was thrilled. He viewed this as one of his main legacies to sign this, and it did seem like a new day in America. Senator Nunn, as you know, under treaties, can't have a treaty unless the Senate agrees. And not only agrees, but agrees by a 2/3 margin. These days, you could not get a 2/3 margin in the United States Senate to endorse motherhood or fatherhood. Our partisanship, and I worked for Republican and Democrat staffs in my career, is so extreme now that everything's gridlock, although they may do something. They did something on criminal justice, and they're about to do something on securing our 2020 elections, and who knows, maybe even background checks. But other than that, it's really pretty grim up there. So you have to get a 2/3 approval of the Senate to get a treaty through. And the kingmaker on all this was Senator Sam Nunn, for whom the school is named that I'm a professor at, and who was my boss for 8 years. And we wrote a report. I still have my copy. What do you think about the INF Treaty in 1988? And Senator Nunn said, this is a great treaty. This is demonstrably in the national security interest of the United States, and it's good for the world. And it's not just because he studied the treaty. He had been involved in the treaty negotiation as an observer since 1985. For 3 years, he went to Geneva and Moscow 4 or 5 times a year to check up on the negotiations and give advice to our negotiators to try to make sure that when they brought the treaty in for a landing, there wasn't a crash like there had been with previous treaties that got rejected by the Senate. The idea was if the Senate's involved from the beginning and they listen to the Senate's advice, you have a better chance of getting the treaty approved. That's Senator Nunn on the far right. He was the first United States senator to meet Gorbachev as General Secretary. The guy on the left is an obscure staffer whose name will remain anonymous, but I had a little more hair back then. Let's just put it that way. So the U.S. ambassador to Soviet Union and a translator in that picture. So what could go wrong? We had the observer group. Senator Nunn was all in on the treaty. This was negotiated against U.S. terms. I mean, totally in line with U.S. terms. And then Senator Nunn announced that he was going to filibuster the INF Treaty and take it hostage. And not only the White House, but NATO went berserk. The Danish foreign minister made a special trip to Washington, gave a speech at the National Press Club and said, please, Sam Nunn, please, Senator Nunn, don't take the INF Treaty hostage. We worked on this for 8 years, and it's a great treaty. Why did Senator Nunn do that? He did it because at the same time the treaty was presented, there was a great controversy brewing in Washington when the Reagan administration decided, based on some obscure legal reanalysis, that the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty that had been observed since the late 60s, had all been a mistake, that we had interpreted the treaty incorrectly, and that it could be reinterpreted to be much more permissive, and that there was in fact no barrier in the treaty to Star Wars. This was good news to Reagan, bad news to the Senate. And Senator Nunn raised his hand and asked a fundamental question, which is, wait a minute, are you actually trying to tell we senators that any president can come up here and say, please prove our treaty by a 2/3 vote? It means X, Y, and Z. And we go, okay, it means X, Y, and Z. And then you can come in next year and say, fooled you on that one. It actually means A, B, and C. So Senator Nunn felt very strongly that consistent with our Constitution and the importance that our founding fathers put on the Senate having this pivotal role in the making of treaties, that it had to be a legal requirement that the United States would interpret any treaty in accordance with what the Senate was told the treaty meant. Now, what that meant for Reagan was he couldn't do Star Wars. Because if this rule applied to INF, then this rule also applied to ABM. And there was a huge standoff and Senator Nunn stared them down. In the end, this resolution of ratification, which was written by some guy named Biden, Senator Biden, included Senator Nunn's key condition on treaty interpretation. And the result was good. The treaty was approved 93-5. I won't tell you who the 5 were. It was amazing to me there were 5 that voted no, since it was such a great treaty, but 5 did vote no, so it was a real debate, and we got the treaty. And it was a great treaty for 30 years. It eliminated, physically destroyed over 2,600 missiles. Think about that. These were chopped up. All the warheads from those missiles were withdrawn to storage or dismantlement. On-site verification, challenge inspections put in place. NATO dodged a bullet and wasn't torn apart by the SS-20 crisis. It created more momentum for arms control, and we got the START treaties coming afterwards. And 30 years of relative stability. But then, trouble in paradise intervened. What could go wrong? This is what went wrong. Russia, not under Gorbachev, but under Putin, decided they needed a new missile. They didn't like the fact that they couldn't have this missile under the INF treaty. It's called the 9M729, and that's a picture of it. What's the story behind this cheating? And I mean that not as an allegation, I mean it as a fact. Well, this set of points was put in the public domain by former Senator Dan Coates, who was the Director of National Intelligence last November, and is the definitive statement by the United States government in which we sort of told the world what we knew, a lot of which was quite sensitive about this missile. I won't read it to you, but suffice it to say, the Russians thought they had come up with a very clever way to develop and test this missile to con us into thinking it was short range, shorter than 500 kilometers in range, and thus not covered by the treaty, and we caught them out on it. Why did they do that? They've got lots of nuclear weapons. They have lots of nuclear weapons, and they have more nuclear weapons that are sort of in the intermediate theater range than we do. I think there's 4 reasons. One is Putin personally believes that Gorbachev gave away the store and detested all the agreements that Gorbachev made. Does any of this sound familiar in terms of U.S. politics today, in terms of the view of the President of the United States about previous treaties, climate change, Iran deal, NAFTA? So that was number one. In Putin's defense, as I said, the INF treaty was basically on U.S. terms, so it was not Gorbachev's great negotiating moment. Second, the INF treaty only covered the United States and the Soviet Union and then Russia. Didn't cover China. And the Russians, although they make nice with China, and they're even doing strategic military exercises together now, there's a long history of rivalry, competition, and adversarial relations in that between those two, and they, particularly their military command, really hated the fact that the INF treaty didn't give them the right to have nuclear missiles of a range that China is now deploying by the hundreds. And neither can we, the United States, by the way, because it's a global treaty. And then third, it's one heck of a weapon, this 9M729. Think about it. If you want to try to, in a war, hit high-value NATO assets and areas, think seaports, headquarters, airfields, tank staging grounds, reinforcement assembly points, critical energy grids. If you need precision strike, you want to use a low-yield nuclear weapon to make sure you kill the target. Well, the first thing you got to make sure is that the other side doesn't kill your missile before you launch it. So ideally, you would like to have the missile way back from where it's going to go. And the range of this thing is so long, thousands of kilometers, that it can be on the eastern side of the Urals. And how are we going to get in there to attack it? Even something like the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter that has stealth technology, the range is limited. And sending in tanker aircraft to fly for several hours east of the Urals is, I was an Air Force pilot, but that's not a mission I would sign up for quickly. By the way, that was my dad's mission during the early 50s. He was a single-seat tactical reconnaissance fighter pilot, and his mission was to fly deep into the Soviet Union and take pictures of their tanks and then try to get the pictures back to his base. He figured he would last 15 minutes if war started. So the missile is way back, long range. It has tremendous accuracy. It flies in at like 100 feet, right on the deck, so it doesn't show up on radar. And it's very difficult to shoot down, even if you see it. Just look what happened in Saudi Arabia this week. They got hit by 17 low-flying cruise missiles. The Saudis have AWACS, they have F-15s, they've got air defense Patriots, they've got radars, they got blindsided. This is what this missile can do. And they thought they could cheat and get away with it. So how did they get caught? If their cheating plan was so clever, how did they get caught? I don't know. I do not know. I had not only top secret clearances, but I had clearances above top secret, and I wasn't cleared to know. The number of people in the United States government who had access to the intelligence that revealed the Russian cheating was extremely limited. It was so limited and so sensitive, we couldn't share it with our allies. Even within the allies like Great Britain that are in this Five Eyes intelligence arrangement that we share almost everything with. It was so sensitive. I always wondered, did we have a mole? Was there someone on the inside who got word out to us? Hey, they're building this illegal cruise missile, guys. Look over here and you'll find it. I don't know. I do not know. I do not have access to that intelligence data, and the head of the DNI has never said. But I will just mention one fact. You may have seen it on TV last month. And the United States had to pull a mole out of the Kremlin. We got him out, and they put him in a safe house in Virginia. Then the media found the safe house. Now I think he's probably in West Virginia. What was his job? He was the senior aide to Putin's foreign policy advisor in the presidential administration. Do you think that guy knew about the 9M729? I would think so. Is that why we had to get him out? Russia connected the dots. How did they find out we were cheating? It must have been you. Anyway, that guy is now in the witness protection program. But again, I don't know, but that's my theory. So given that we knew, what do you do? Well, the point I want to make is that we worked, and by we, I mean, including myself here, I spent I don't know how many days in negotiations with allies saying, we need your help on this. The Russians are stonewalling this. They deny the missile even exists. Later, they admitted it existed, and I showed you the picture of it, but they said it has a different range. So the Obama administration spent 4 years in negotiations, going to Moscow saying, hey, come on, you're cheating, you're putting the treaty at risk, and sort of preparing some options for what we might do if they didn't admit it and fix it, to put some teeth in the negotiation. Trump inherited this situation. They spent 2 years going to Moscow saying, we got the goods on you. Eventually, we gave enough information to our NATO allies that they came in behind us, but the Russians still stonewalled. They said, we're not cheating, you're cheating, disinformation, noise, not good. You can argue, did we give up too soon? I don't know. 6 years is a long time to try to fix a cheater. But I just want you to know that the United States government, through 2 administrations as different as Obama and Trump, tried for 6 years through diplomacy before Trump said, no, not going to work. So starting really last November, we went to NATO and said, look, we're getting nowhere and it's been 6 years. And NATO said, you're right. The Secretary General of NATO said, it's down to Russia. The NATO foreign ministers, NATO operates by consensus. That means everyone has to agree in NATO or there's no agreement. Another way to put that is that everyone has a veto, even Albania and Montenegro, over what we do in NATO. So when I say NATO foreign ministers, I mean the governments of 29 countries, as different as Canada and Lithuania, agreed that Russia violated the treaty and that that's not sustainable. Maybe some in NATO would have liked us to try another year or two. But Trump basically said, because this is his style, the art of the deal, hard demands. We're going to start developing our own systems that violate the treaty. And that clock is ticking down. You've got 6 months to stop us or the treaty's gone. And the Russians still didn't admit it. So on the 2nd of August, the treaty expired, even though it was arguably the most successful treaty in the history of the United States, other than maybe the NATO treaty itself. So what happens now? There's no INF. Is it the end of the world? Is it arms race, nuclear war before you can finish your degree, or not? Well, that's one possibility. There are others. I'd leave it to you to decide which of these 4 you think is the most likely. Let's just look at them. There's certainly the possibility of a really bad arms race. If Russia keeps deploying these things and adds other systems, other nuclear systems they're now deploying in Europe, including in Kaliningrad. By the way, I don't know if you ever looked at a map, but Kaliningrad is part of Russia in the same way that Alaska is part of the United States. But there's a country in between, 2 countries in between Kaliningrad and Russia. They're called Poland and Lithuania. So the Russians are on the western side of Poland and Lithuania, and they're cramming this nuclear Iskander missile into Kaliningrad. So they're surrounding NATO with nuclear systems beyond this cruise missile. So if Russia keeps this up, this really intense modernization, what's NATO going to do? What NATO has agreed there are not going to be any more U.S. nuclear systems, new nuclear systems going into Western Europe, because they know what happened. It wouldn't be 300,000 people on the street. It'd be 3 million people on the street. It would be like an anti-Brexit demonstration. Why? Well, frankly, the Europeans don't trust Trump anymore. So it would be much worse than 1979, where it was Jimmy Carter that they were protesting against, and then Ronald Reagan. So NATO's ruled out any new nuclear systems going on the soil of Western European allies, but they would go forward with these new systems the Pentagon is developing that don't comply with the treaty, and some that are outside the treaty, like sea-launched nuclear systems. And I think importantly, my personal view is that NATO would probably have to take its missile defense system, which for 9 years they've promised Russia is not aimed at them, but is aimed at Iran, and use it to defend against these Russian systems. In 1988, when Senator Nunn wrote this report, he asked himself, and it's in the report on page 11, what if the Russians cheat? So it's interesting to see what Senator Nunn thought 31 years ago in this situation. He said, in view of the record of Soviet noncompliance with their arms control commitments and the proliferation of systems capable of delivering nuclear weapons elsewhere in the world, the Senate Armed Services Committee recommends support for vigorous development of ballistic missile defense options. So Senator Nunn's thinking 31 years ago was that if we got in this situation, it'd be good to have some really good missile defense systems in place. So I think what NATO would probably do is reorient its Aegis-class ships and land-based Aegis missile defense facilities in Romania and Poland to provide a defense in being against this new Russian threat. And then the Russians, who've claimed all along that we've been cheating under the INF Treaty by hiding illegal cruise missiles in our Aegis systems. We haven't, but that's been their claim. It's disinformation. They would say, I told you so, and make that be the pretext for Putin now deploying all of these new super weapons that he's been putting on TV, including the hypersonic boost glide missile and the air-launched ballistic missile. And they would say none of these systems are covered by the New START treaty. The U.S. has said, unless Russia agrees these new systems are covered by the New START treaty, we're not going to extend it. And that's going to expire in 2021. So it's certainly possible that 2 years from now, if I come back and speak here at Georgia Tech, we could be in a really ugly arms race, A, and B, there's no arms control left. INF's gone, New START's gone, no new agreements, nada. Katie, bar the door. But that's not the only possibility, of course. That's certainly not President Trump's answer to my question. President Trump's answer to my question is we'll negotiate a better treaty. We'll do a redo and bring China in. There's a big problem with that. China has said, over our dead bodies are we going to be brought into the INF treaty. They have categorically ruled it out. Beyond that, if China had a change of mind or you pressured them into it, through more trade sanctions or tariffs or something, somebody's going to raise their hand again and say, but wait a minute, what about the Iranians? What about the North Koreans? What about India, Pakistan, France, and the UK? What about Israel? They all have ballistic nuclear missiles of this range. Or do they get a free walk? Now, I spent 30 years in arms control negotiations, but I would not want to be given the negotiating portfolio to try to work out a multilateral agreement that included all of those countries plus the United States and Russia. That, in my view, is as close to mission impossible as I can imagine. And then there's the question of Ukraine, which is an interesting question because before the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, all these ballistic missiles that the Soviets were deploying were being manufactured in Ukraine. And Ukraine had the third largest nuclear inventory in the world in 1991 on their soil. They agreed in 1994 under something called the Budapest Memorandum to give up their nuclear weapons. I sat across from Ukrainian diplomats and they said, I hope this isn't politically incorrect, but in effect they were asking, will you still love me in the morning? If we agree to do this, will you really have our back when push comes to shove? And I said, yes, you can count on us. That's what I said to my counterparts in 1994. You can count on the United States. So when the Russians seized Crimea and intervened in eastern Ukraine, in 2014, and those diplomats said, you remember that Budapest memorandum? We sort of said, yeah, humma, humma, humma. And the rest is history. So there are senior political people in the Ukraine, not the current president, who is a TV comedian, but who have said, we should have never given up the nukes. We've still got the factories to make these missiles. Let's get back in the game ourselves. So the idea of a multinational INF is complex and problematic, but maybe President Trump could do it. I don't know. There's another option. This one was put forward by a very senior American negotiator. In fact, she negotiated the New START treaty as part of the Obama administration. She just gave her valedictorian address last week at University of Oslo. She is the first woman in the 70-year history of NATO to be the Deputy Secretary General, the number 2 person at NATO. There's never been a female Secretary General, at least not yet. But Rose made it to deputy, and she steps down next week. So she gave her farewell speech, and from the soul laid out some ideas to save the INF treaty. Make it a ceiling on U.S. and Russian systems, so each side can have some missiles, but not unlimited missiles, and limit it only to missiles that have nuclear warheads. That way, Russia can have some nuclear systems to deter China, and we can go forward with the ground-launched missiles that we're now testing and developing that we don't intend to be nuclear, but precision conventional strike, and see if we can get someone like Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan to accept basing on their soil against China. And if that doesn't work out, maybe we can put them on the island of Guam, which we own and can do what we want, even though it's essentially out of range. But anyway, that seems to be the idea. So her idea is clever because it takes the China piece out of the equation. You no longer need to try to multilateralize the treaty. You can keep it bilateral. It's like INF light or 2.0. But this assumes anybody in the current administration is listening to Rose Gottemoeller, which is not the case. John Bolton spent 2 years trying to get her fired at NATO. So even though he's gone, we'll see if anyone picks up on Rose's ideas. So if none of those ideas work, what's left? Well, what's usually the case, and your professor will, I'm sure, develop this in the course of the full semester, what often happens in international relations is countries muddle through. I think it was Clausewitz said no military plan survives the first engagement. You have to improvise, you have to compromise, you have to come up with ad hoc solutions. And there's the possibility that we won't have an arms race, we won't have new treaties, we won't save the old treaty, but the world won't go to hell, and you'll get to finish your degrees and have long and productive lives. Through reciprocal but de facto restraint, not formal, legalistic, treaty-based de jure restrictions. As I mentioned earlier, NATO has made clear, not going to do it. We're not going to get into some deal where the U.S. is putting new cruise missiles with nuclear warheads into Western Europe and have 500,000 people on the streets. We are not going to do that. And now the Russian defense minister has said, well, you don't do that, we won't do it. Now, it's a little disingenuous because they've already done it with the 9M729. They just don't admit that that's an INF system. But in effect, the Russians are saying, if you show restraint, we'll show restraint. And in the case of the U.S., since we can't put any missiles in Western Europe, I don't think we're going to talk any of our Pacific allies, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, into accepting new missiles, even if they're not nuclear. If they're seen to be targeted on China's nuclear systems. China has said, end of the world, if you put in missile defenses, that's going to be contentious. So it's possible that we will develop some systems but not deploy them. The Russians will decide to cut their losses, not make any more of the illegal cruise missiles and keep them east of the Urals. And life can go on in Western Europe. Not as good as an INF treaty arrangement, but maybe just good enough. I'll stop there.
Thank you. We have just a handful of minutes before class ends, so we have quick questions and quick answers.
Well, if nobody else will start.
This is why professors are well paid, so they can come to the rescue in moments like this.
I actually am wondering if muddled response doesn't become the most likely response simply because of the cycle we're in. In other words, when you had Gorbachev and Reagan back in the day coming from a position where it was advantageous for them both to sort of make strides on a treaty, today we're in a position where it's really not advantageous for Trump electorally to take any sort of policy stand because it could be costly in one realm, either in a base or across the aisle. And it certainly isn't probably in Putin's best interest to negotiate down. So is it the fact that we're in this sort of weird cycle that makes muddling through the most likely option, and we kind of have to stall for 2 or maybe 6 years until we can get to a new treaty?
Steve, I think that's right on in terms of INF, which I think is sadly, but frankly, lost. I mean, I don't think, even if Mr. Trump saw it, and occasionally, you know, he says, I'll meet with Putin, I'll meet with Kim Jong-un, I'll meet with Rouhani, and we'll make a deal, and it'll be wonderful. But I don't see him intervening on INF. I think the larger question is what happens between now and November 2020, when we vote again at the presidential level, to the New START treaty, which is the last remaining element of the whole arms control framework that was put in place by administrations from Nixon through Obama. Because the New START treaty, which the United States government, the Trump administration, has testified to Congress the Russians are not cheating on, they're observing it, is due to expire in 2021. But Rose Gottmuller, who I mentioned and was our chief negotiator on it, wrote into the treaty, it's part of the treaty, a provision that says the two sides can agree to extend it for 5 years with a signature by the presidents. Does not have to go to the Senate. So the New START treaty expires, I think, on January 31st, 2021. That means one of two things could happen. Trump not wanting to stand for re-election in November, saying I'm letting this treaty go and there's no arms control, and having that base, Democratic base, the arms control constituency in America, really concerned. He just says, we're going to extend New START to buy time for me to show you I can get a much better deal that includes China and Putin's hypersonic glide boost thing, and you know, no one will know if that works for 5 years. You've got 5 years to try to pull that off. So he could save the New START treaty if he decided to do it. The main roadblock to that was John Bolton, who was totally opposed to New START and had basically said, over my dead body, are we extending this? Or a Democrat could win in November, running on a platform, among other things, that we need to try to restore stability in NATO, and part of that is putting arms control back in place. And if I haven't heard Elizabeth Warren say this, but I can imagine her saying it, if I'm elected and take office on January 20th, 2021, before the end of that month, I will send the necessary signature to Moscow to save the New START treaty for 5 years. So there's another cycle coming that could play out in different ways.
I don't know exactly when, but Putin has said that he's not running for another term. If he's being honest there, do you think that means that the muddled through strategy might last until the end of Putin's regime, or at least but once a new Russian president comes to power, if Putin is being honest, there might be new possibilities for a new INF or something along those lines?
Well, the two parts of that. One is, what's Putin's position on New START extension itself, let alone whether he goes for a third term. Their official position is, if we will agree to extend it, they will agree to extend it. But in extending it, they are not admitting that these new weapons that Putin's been doing the videos on TV about are covered. So we'd have to agree to extend it, accepting that we don't agree on the coverage to these new systems. I think that could happen. Then there's the question of, is Putin ready to let go?
Yeah.
I don't personally think he is. When he was president the first time, he had a term limit, and when he stepped down and became prime minister and Dmitry Medvedev took over, I think there was conjecture that there'd be a new day in Russia, that there'd be more freedom, that the Russian people would be happy to get out under so much heavy hand of Putin, and that Medvedev could keep Putin from coming back. Yeah, didn't work out that way. It became totally clear, whatever we thought, and whatever our intelligence community thought, that Medvedev was 100% Putin's puppet, and the whole thing was a kabuki dance, sort of like when George Wallace put his wife in to be governor of Alabama. I can say that, I come from Alabama. So I personally think Putin has probably watched what the Chinese leader has done, which was carefully neutralize his military and arrest a lot of his opponents and work the system and then get the constitution changed so that the Chinese president is now president for life. But we'll see.
All right. Now we're coming to the end of the class time. We have the room for a bit longer, so if you want to stay, you can. But I know, the class hour is inviolate, so I'd like to take this opportunity while everybody's still here to thank Robert Bell for a fascinating.